All right, well, welcome everyone to the Reach Spark presentation for March 23rd. And today we have Brett McQueen presenting. And the title of the presentation is Building a Value Portfolio Throughout the Life Cycle of Innovation. And so Dr. McQueen is in the School of Pharmacy. He's an assistant professor and director for the Center for Pharmaceutical Value, known as P-Value. And his research interests include cost effectiveness applications and methods development, multi-criteria decision analysis, which is an abbreviation that I wouldn't have known, MCDA, value-based outcomes contracting, and patient preferences research. He is active in health economics related societies, including the International Society for Pharmacoeconomics and Outcomes Research. And then contributes to that group through short courses, workshops, issue panels, and research presentations. And he also collaborates with the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review on value-based pricing and reimbursement estimation, which often includes cell and gene therapies, which is kind of a newer area. He works with Colorado Medicaid to negotiate and track value-based outcome agreements to improve access to care using value and affordability-based approaches. So I thought it was really important to, ask Brett McQueen to come talk to us, because I've had some conversations with him through a device that I'm working on. And it's always an interesting discussion to kind of think through some of the economic aspects, even if you're not ready to start selling something. And I think the quote that I remember that Brett has said to me is, a lot of people don't think about these things until it's almost too late. And they should be thinking about it much earlier in their product development. So hopefully he'll talk to us a little bit about that and have a nice interactive session where, folks can ask pending questions that you may have about your own technology. So I'll turn that over to you, Brett.
Brad, I'm going to interrupt you before you get started. Sorry. I have not gotten a note that it's being recorded. So I hit pause on the recording earlier and I'm going to unpause it.
Okay, now mine says recording on mine. Yeah. Does it? You're not seeing it.
And did everyone get the note saying this session is being recorded? Yes, okay, cool. Yes. So long as Melanie's getting it.
Because you're a host.
Yeah. Okay, fine. Sorry, Brett, go ahead.
No, that's fine. I actually have some polling questions. I hope that's okay. Just because when you're talking about economics, people tend to fall asleep. So I have to have some way to keep people partially awake. So yeah, thank you for the intro and the invitation. Most of my world lives really post-market. Most of my research, but that said, I do a lot more and more. I'm doing a lot more early phase work, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But in general, I'll kind of go over. I just want everyone to have a base knowledge of some of the concepts of pharmacoeconomics, and then how it fits into reimbursement decision making. Can you see the slides, by the way? Okay, yeah. Should ask that first. And I think it's really helpful because when we talk about, I think there's so much innovation on campus. And as Melanie said, I often talk to people and my first question is, well, how are you going to sell it? And what I mean by sell it is who's going to pay and how are they going to pay? And do you know what other resources are going to be foregone because you brought in a new technology? I think that's really important to understand people's incentives and how they make decisions. The other part that I just was appointed as a council member on the Prescription Drug Affordability Board in Colorado, which is the first of its kind in our state. And I have to say that just general policymakers really don't know that much about paying for medicines because it's really complicated, and I wouldn't expect them to. It really goes deep, and I've been down the rabbit hole, and I can tell you it's really ugly, and we can get into that if you'd like. So bear with me. I have 60 slides, but I really want you to just jump in. We don't have to get through all of it. Some of it is so didactic that I feel like maybe should I even have put those slides in. Feel free to stop me. I'm used to conversations rather than me sitting here speaking to you. But I do want to go over some background. And Ken Arrow, who passed away in 2017, is really kind of the godfather of health economics. And he was a really just kind of a brilliant man, period. He did so much for economics as a field. And this quote is my favorite, where he says, it's always been a favorite activity of economists to point out that actions which on their face achieve a desirable goal may have less obvious consequences, particularly over time, which more than offset the original gains. This quote is like, this is what I do with my job every single day. I try to tell people, and I try to reveal what is explicit, and often the decisions that we make are implicit to us, and we're not really thinking about what's happening elsewhere and what's happening throughout the system. And that's really what my job is in health. So, all right, a little bit of economics. I know, please try to just bear with me as we make it through this. But when we're talking about efficiency and allocation of resources, we're trying to minimize waste and optimize how we purchase goods. We do that so easily with anything that you buy, regular, food or clothing or anything else at your house. You're really good about knowing exactly what you want, and you respond to the price. That's why so many, Groupons are popular, and so many different aspects of lowering price really helps us make better decisions about what we want. But then other factors, including our preferences and income, really matter. So sure, like I would love to not be driving around in my Honda Civic that I've had since grad school, but I can't exactly go out and get an F-150. That's like what I wanted my whole life, and I can't get it because we're just not there yet. So my preference might be an F-150, but I don't have the income level to meet that. So right now it's a Honda Civic, and of course my wife drives the four-wheel drive vehicle because that's how it works. So just a side note. And this is kind of, Ken Arrow talked about this as well, that demand for medical services is not steady. It's not like food or clothing. It's unpredictable. There are two things involved in healthcare: risk and uncertainty. And you don't know if we give someone a device or a treatment, and I have this argument with physicians all the time, you might say give somebody an LDL lowering medication, and you're so certain that it lowers their LDL, and maybe you're 100% certain that it will, but there's no way you're 100% certain that it's going to avoid a heart attack. You can't say that with any level of certainty beyond a percentage that was determined from a clinical trial. There's no way that you're going to say 100%. It's just always uncertain. Death is, the probability is 1. We are going to die. The point is, can we do it with dignity, and can we have treatments that can mitigate death and extend our life? And so I think that's where Arrow really set out this argument for public insurance, both Medicaid and Medicare, and he did that, was part of that argument for doing it. So how do we actually allocate healthcare efficiently? Well, the easy answer is we don't in this country at all, but we do some things actually kind of well. Achieving what we would call dynamic efficiency means that we want our group here on campus to get enough R&D money to develop something, but we also want the point of sale to be cheap enough for that person to afford, right? Like we want the out-of-pocket payments to be less. We want to make it so cheap that people can access it, but we also need that trigger in our brain that says, I can go out and produce something and I can be rich, or I could be on the board of some company, whatever it is that you want in life. There will be some carrot there for you to get it. And that's the whole concept. That's what we're trying to do. And insurance, at least in theory, can do that. But I think insurers make decisions that aren't in their best interest. And I tell them that to their face. So that's okay. There are a lot of distortions, and this is where we get into the complications. Trust me, I'm getting to the point very soon. But there are a lot of distortions. Physicians don't know exactly what a patient is going to want. Most physicians will not agree to this. They have a formulary of like 10 to 15 drugs in their head. And they say, I've used this before, it works. We have no idea what that actual person and the patient will take, whether it's an oral medication or an injection. Maybe they don't want to go to an infusion center every month and they'd rather just take the less effective oral option. Moral hazard is another one where people are a lot more cautious, when they don't have insurance. When they have insurance, it's a different story. I'm not saying they're going to go out and do crazy stuff, although in Colorado, it seems like people like to just go head first down a mountain on a bike or on skis. I'm not that risk seeking, but obviously most people around me are. Adverse selection is one thing we've actually fixed in part with the ACA. You can't just, I don't know if you remember this, you couldn't get insurance if you had a chronic condition. I mean, it's crazy to think that was just 10 years ago in this country. And then there's a lot of heterogeneity, like I talked about with preferences. Not everyone wants an F-150. People want BMWs, people want Porsches. You know, that's never appealed to me, but that's why we have individual preferences. And why am I telling you all of this? It's because inefficient markets lead to high prices. It's really that simple. And anyone that says, you'll hear a politician maybe like once a year come out and say, let's just open healthcare to a free market. They're full of it. They're either lying to you or they don't know, which both are terrible options, but I have a feeling most of them are somehow engaged in some sort of monetary reward for saying something like that. It's not a free market. It will never be because of the distortions. It's just not like buying cars. It's not like buying Snicker bars. It's not like buying clothing. It just isn't. And then distortions really, again, lead to these high prices, but they're compounded by government and private policies that are not great, including inequitable distribution, an overly generous patent system, which you all should be completely exploiting. And I can talk about that if you like, but the patent system is so generous in this country. So what does this all mean? Lately, we've had this kind of public pressure on rising prices. It's hard to do anything about it because we have this fragmented system and Medicare can't negotiate directly. They let the individual plans do it. And I can talk about that more if you'd like, but basically it means we don't have very much market power. And since then, we have this market initiated, what we call value assessment, or it's also called health technology assessment. It's a new term in this country. It is not in every other high income country. All across Europe, they have a separate body like the FDA that just works on reimbursement. In the UK, it's called NICE, or the National Institute for Healthcare and Excellence. I think that's right. And they basically say, if you want to sell your drug here, it's got to be at this price. And if it's not at this price, then we're just not going to cover it. We won't pay for it. And if patients want to buy it themselves, that's another option. It's new to us because we haven't had any government mandates. It's very scary to talk about this. The work that I do is really controversial. I've been called like a death panelist. There's been threats to me personally, a lot of trying to bash my integrity, all different sorts of things that because I do this research, there's a very negative perception that I'm trying to restrict access to patients. So it's not easy to do, but I love it, so I'm not leaving. So everyone can you know, scare off, I guess. So I think that the general point is that we do need economic evaluation, and we're doing it implicitly. We're just value assessment and health technology assessment is just the explicit discussion of this problem and of this economic evaluation piece. And more payers, private payers, are actually requiring this information, mainly because they have very fixed budgets that are based on your premiums that you pay. So the more they increase their premiums, the greater the chance that you leave. And then they can't pay for all of the healthcare for everyone, thus that becomes the problem. And that's why there's prior authorizations. That's why there's step edit policies. All of you, I'm sure, know someone that has gone through this, where you're waiting for a month for something to be approved, back and forth between your physician and the insurance company. They're trying to avoid paying for it because their budget is tight, and there's a lot of big ticket items that need to be discussed. So, and I'll get to your question in a minute here as we get to the end of this section. I promise I'm almost done. And the other thing I want just to make clear is that we currently actually make the decision who will not receive care by deciding who does receive care. So when a physician or a prescriber says, I'm gonna give you this drug, or I'm gonna not give you this drug because it didn't meet some p-value that we established at the beginning, you're basically saying, well, you don't get that care, you don't get those health benefits. Yeah, you don't get the increase in cost, but you also don't get the health benefits. That's a decision. If you don't make a decision, it's still a decision. The patient is in front of you, they're talking to you, they have a need in healthcare that's not being met. And the other thing to point out is efficiency is not the same thing as cost cutting. It is about value, and I'll get into how we define that in a little bit. Opportunity cost, if you're not familiar with this, is literally just the loss of potential gain from other alternatives when something is chosen. You can think about this more in terms of finances, like if you had your money sitting in a bank account, in a savings account, the real alternative to that should be putting it on the market where you can gain 6, 10, maybe even 12%. That's the opportunity cost. The difference between those two, that's the money that you're losing. But in health, it's a little bit different. There's time away from work, there's quality of life. Some of these things are really hard to define. And in the US, it really impacts drug prices indirectly. So we come in and we say the price should be this, and a payer takes our report or our information and says, you know, you're charging X dollars when it really should be Y dollars. And then that's how the negotiation starts. In the UK, for example, it's direct negotiation. There's no indirect. This is what we're gonna reimburse. Either you sell your drug at this price or you don't. It doesn't matter. Now, budget caps create some perverse incentives, and that's actually what Colorado's proposing. I told them that, and they weren't happy with me. Okay, so I have a little exercise. If you go to, you can just do this on your smartphone. You don't have to do this on your computer. And we're gonna have a couple more of these. Don't feel like you have to, but if you go to menti.com, just on your phone or wherever, type in 29769585. I'm gonna essentially ask you about these two lives. Which one would you say is better, or are they about the same? So A is, I'm living 5 years in full health, totally happy, no problems, and then I die after 5 years. B is, I have moderate problems walking for the entire 10 years. I have severe problems washing or dressing myself, severe pain, discomfort, anxious, depressed, and you live longer, but you have those problems for the entire 5 years. So with that, which life is better for you as a person, or are they about the same? This is the result every time, every single time. This is how people answer it. And I think it's interesting because what we would do, so this is an actual experiment that we do in our work. We adjust that time frame of A and B until all of your responses are 50-50, until there's an indifference point where everyone, ideally a larger sample, thousands of people around the country, would do this exercise. And they have done this. There's a whole group at Illinois and Chicago that did this in the United States, and Denver was one of the sites. And they make it so that they adjust that until it hits 50%. So it'd be like 3 or 4 in each A and B, or maybe about the same as included as well. And that's what we would call an indifference point. And that's your preference for a treatment that would improve life B to meet life A. So somewhere you meet in the middle so that you take a treatment and you feel like they're both equivalent with or without, with the drug with life B, and then without the drug with life A. All right, so I'll stop there. And it looks like we have a question. How do we reconcile the larger US market helping drive opportunity creation that the rest of the world benefits from? Yeah, that's a really good question. By having such inflated pricing, we absolutely are subsidizing the international community, and there's evidence on that. We actually have studied that in the field. There is really no way to reconcile it. All of my European colleagues, they do a lot of work in Europe, and they recognize it. They also have the conversations with the general public very openly that should we really be spending $1 million to keep someone alive at the end of their life, in the last year of their life? We don't feel like that's a good use of our resources. And to be honest, the population as a society, as a group, as an average, agrees with the government on those decisions. We just don't have those talks here. We just let companies charge whatever they want because that's the system that we've built. And it's up to insurance companies to make it work. So I don't really have an answer for you other than it really is going to require more of an explicit discussion with the general public and understanding that this is one point that I make that is sometimes surprising, but for example, the amount of attention on one disease versus another. So, one of the many cancers where you have like a superstar athlete, or maybe it's a singer or something like that, comes out and says, we really need to pay attention to this. I'm not saying we don't need to pay attention to it, but by drawing all of the funds and pushing all of the money there, we're actually taking away from other disease areas and other people that don't have a superstar backing them. And it's hard to say that, and it's hard to hear it, but that's really the truth. Even in the US, we do have limited resources. We can't just fund every single treatment for every disease. That's really not how it works. Even if we had removed the amount of military funding we have and push it to health, there's only so far that we really can go. Stephen says the last exercise is unrealistic in that one rarely knows that X will be the outcome. Rather, there is a probability that the life will be A like and another that will be B like, but most probably will be in between. Yeah, no, I don't. It's not. I don't think it's supposed to be that realistic, Stephen. I think it's one of those exercises where we're trying to get at preferences, and what you're bringing up is difficult with preference research, where you're trying to make it so that someone can understand the exercise and not confuse them, but also generate non-biased preferences, and there's trade-offs there. So I see what you're saying, and that while isn't necessarily like an actual example, it usually is an example that's a little bit more detailed, where you actually give a profile of a treatment and says, here's A and B, and then it gives all the different characteristics like mode of administration, impact on symptoms. So usually there's a little bit more detail there, but I was just giving you kind of a simplified example. Okay, so I'm going to talk. Anyone else have any questions? Did I miss anyone's hand up, or is everyone like asleep yet? I see Melanie's not, but Melanie sort of likes this stuff, so I don't want to just assume that everyone else does. Okay, all right. So I'm going to jump into some coverage and reimbursement stuff. The first thing I'll put up here, because this I think is kind of relevant for the products that you might develop. Price sensitivity is actually a big deal especially without insurance, but even with insurance. If you have a patient with a chronic disease, which isn't necessarily severe and it's asymptomatic, so think like hypertension, there's really not that big of an issue with shopping around and finding a lower price. And they're very price sensitive to the point where pennies will change how whether they would change a drug or not. Whereas lower sensitivity, think like EpiPen. So there are a lot of people that wanted to study the price increase in EpiPen. Surprise, surprise, utilization didn't change. In fact, it went up. Because do you really want to send your kid to school without an EpiPen if they have an attack and they have an allergic attack and now you can't treat them? they don't care. They'll stop eating for a month if they have to. There's no way they're letting their kid go without an EpiPen if they need it. So this is really important to understand what condition you're actually developing your product in, because it does determine the price sensitivity not only of the patient, but it actually determines the price sensitivity of the payer. Because payers, what they ended up doing when they increased the price, we studied this, the price for individuals went up slightly, but for payers, it shot up dramatically. They had no problem covering it. It was all of our premiums that ended up covering EpiPens. It's a big deal, and payers understand that, and patients understand that. There's no getting around this truth between these two. So always think about that when you're developing a product. The other thing I think that's important is insurance companies actually don't negotiate on price. This is kind of a surprise. They negotiate based on utilization. So they'll say, sure, you can price your drug however you want, but you're not getting on our formulary. You'll be on tier 4 if they have it, which is co-insurance, or you'll be on some non-preferred tier if you're like Medicaid. And they'll just essentially say, we're just not going to sell your drug unless somebody asks for it and is willing to pay almost the entire bill for it. So they don't usually negotiate directly on price. They negotiate on utilization and allocation of the drug. Generics are always the lowest price tiers. Walmart has the $4 prescription. They can do that because people come to Walmart and you get like a couch plus some pizza pockets and your prescription, right? I mean, you go in and you get all this different stuff. They're basing everything on the traffic that comes through. Branded drugs are on high price tiers. They involve prior authorizations, step edits, so you have to fail something before you move up. And then the highest tier is like a percentage, which is 25 to 30% of the drug, which can be a lot. If it's a biologic, you're looking at, you could pay something in the range of 15 to 20,000 a year for a biologic. This is also the function of high deductible plans. This is what happens to patients on high deductible plans with chronic disease. PBMs, have you probably heard of PBMs? And I talked about Walmart. They actually don't need a PBM because they're just so rich and they don't need to pay a PBM to do it. They just have a whole group that does it for them. But essentially, most health plans say, including Medicaid, says we don't really want to have to figure this out. You stay up to date on what drugs are new, what we want to cover, what we don't want to cover. And they'll do the rebate negotiation for them and say, if you give us, I think all of you have seen a commercial for Humira, like 15, 20 times, right? Who's seen a commercial on Humira? Humira is the classic example in health economics of an evil empire of patent abuse. And they have had a patent for way longer than they should have. But they do it because they get new indications and they basically negotiate on their portfolio. So they say, we have 10 or 12 indications. We'll give you a rebate across all of those that covers X million patients. Another drug comes along and says, we developed a better drug. It's cheaper, it's more effective. And the insurer says, well, we're not going to sell it here. And they ask why? Well, because if we give up our rebates for Humira, then we'll have no reason to pay for your drug. We'll be way over our budget. So there are drugs like that really play the rebate game. And then you probably have heard about pharmacy benefit managers skimming off the top. And that's been the problem in the recent federal legislation around that. So how does it work in the US? It's a little bit different. There's a group called the Institute for Clinical Economic Review. I work with them directly, collaborate on about a report every year. And we estimate drug prices for usually really complex methods like CAR-Ts. So we did the CAR-T report for leukemia and lymphoma. And then we just did another CAR-T report for multiple myeloma, which they just have a new indication for. And really the report comes out and then a group like CVS Caremark says, which is a PBM, says, you know what, if ICER said it's greater than this threshold, which is very controversial, then we're just not going to cover it. And that's a pretty big shift in the market. We've never had anything like that come about. So it's scary a little bit for health economists to jump into that. But I would say largely it's really used for, again, starting point for price negotiations. There's been some evidence it's worked. Amgen dropped their price of Repatha to what ICER had suggested, and then it became a huge argument because insurers did not increase access for that. This is another piece that's really important. The decision context is something that I think I'll probably hammer home this point a couple more times, but decision context is kind of everything. And what I mean by this is who's paying for it and what is the actual decision being made? Is it a prescription that you're giving a patient? Is it a guideline or utilization management to say this is going to flow into like the American Diabetes Association's treatment guidelines? Or is it at the kind of health benefit package, coverage and pricing? Are we actually going to cover this drug on our formulary? All of those matter. And when you develop a product, you might be at different levels of this. And you might not actually know where you're going to be until you're post-marketing. But it's really important that you think about this early on. Okay, so a little test to see if I was boring you truly. Insurers influence price reductions through the use of tiered formularies, true or false? All right. Good, I'm not that boring today, maybe. Is that the case? We'll see. We've got more time. In general, patients are more price sensitive to interventions for acute, life-threatening diseases, more so than for treatments for chronic disease. True or false? Maybe it's the way I wrote the question. No, that's right. Yeah, so patients with chronic disease will shop around more. That's the other way to say this. And then patients with acute life-threatening disease, they don't care. They're not going to shop around. They need what they need, and they'll pay whatever it takes to get there. All right. Thank you for answering the questions. Looks like Chris has a question. How does personalized medicine, cancer treatments, influence insurance pricing tiers? Yeah, that's a really good question. In general, and this is a whole area that I study, is kind of what do we know beyond the trial? Like what other factors can we not quantify? And how does that influence how people make a decision? We know that other factors like first to market, novel mechanism of action, high benefit, high clinical benefit compared to standard of care, which can be quantified. These are all major factors for insurance companies to just flat out cover it regardless. And cancer is one of those where health insurers have so much public pushback if they don't cover it that they end up just saying, you know what, we'll just cover it. And we're not going to argue because we're going to have some, again, that rock star that's going to come around and say, this insurance company isn't covering it. But I have to tell you, we're paying for it through our premiums either way. And not only that, but we're actually forcing the insurance company to show up in other areas and say, we can't cover that drug for that other condition because we have to cover the cancer condition here. That is the reality. And no insurance company will ever tell you that. I'm telling you that is the absolute truth. There's no way around it. I already know that is the truth. And in some cases, we've actually shown that to be the case. And it's just that in Europe, they're so much more explicit about it. They actually estimate the lost benefits that would occur if we covered something so expensive that was over what we're willing to pay. And they'll actually say, we're not going to cover this stuff over here. We're going to disinvest in another disease area. How do you think those patients feel then? Like, oh, wow, we're second tier. That's what's happening. And no one wants to admit it, but that's the truth. So Melanie says if one can skew the condition and figure out the rebates, then can negotiate better deals with payers. What do you mean by that?
I figured you were going to ask me that. So based on what you were saying and the adalimumab story with the rebates, right, where they link those rebates and then they spread it across. So I guess in terms of if you were developing something and thinking about a strategy for reimbursement, you would want to see about the conditions, like whether there's like more serious conditions versus less serious conditions, and how you wanted to kind of package that story along with the rebate approach. You could negotiate pretty well.
That's the entire business model of pharmaceutical industry in the United States. That's their whole business model, is what hasn't been done. Can we take this drug that was developed 20 years ago and apply it to this really severe condition, get an indication, run a trial, get an investor to pay for the trial, get it approved, and then we have a patent for the next 7 years after the trial ends, and we'll make $1 billion or $2 billion a quarter. I mean, that's the business model. And that's why you're seeing so much. There's some government interventions that have happened to increase rare disease, and I'm not saying it's not important. I think it is, but you're right. I mean, you can just walk in and say, oh, this is a nice little gap here. And there are there are ways to do it less subtle than Martin Shkreli, but there are other ways, to do it like he did. And then you get sued and you go to jail. So pharma companies are just very subtle about it. And I'm not going to argue against developing a drug for kids with SMA. Who's going to argue with that? I mean, you want to charge $1 million and the kid lives for a little bit longer. I have no issue with it. I think it's a good thing. But you're right to question the motive of whether they're really doing it for the patients or they're really doing it for profit. I think it would just be better for everyone if we just admitted this was a profit-seeking venture, and that's what we're doing. And I don't understand why it's so controversial, I guess. And then the other question, does that include the diagnostic tests? Diagnostics are so, payers hate diagnostics because unless it's associated with a drug, then it's like, what do we do with this thing? Why are we covering this? Why are we paying for it? And we did a risk sharing agreement. So this is something that I'm helping Medicaid with right now, where we developed a risk sharing agreement with a payer and a lab company to increase non-invasive prenatal testing for pregnant women. And trying to avoid going down the path of amniocentesis or whatever the other one is, I'm forgetting, CVS or something, sampling, where there's an invasive process. They're trying to just avoid that altogether. And the agreement we came up with was the manufacturer of the lab tests would cover the first year of the budget. And say any increase in the cost will be borne by us as the company. You don't have to worry about that. And then the payer can say, after that, is the budget reasonable going forward so that we can continue to cover this without the manufacturer helping us? That's how diagnostic tests have gotten more pickup in the market. And that's part of my job, is to come up with payment arrangements that make both sides happy enough that we can increase access to patients. And that's what we're doing with Medicaid right now. So it's a good question. David, GoodRx. David, I was wondering if I should include my GoodRx slide. So GoodRx is, I'm trying to just not be negative about this because I think it's good. GoodRx is kind of like an electronic version of cutting out coupons at Safeway and putting them on your smartphone. So you can do what GoodRx has done. You just call Walgreens. Everyone asks me this, like, why is it so expensive at Walgreens versus King Supers? It's because every single one of those pharmacies has individual contracts with the PBM. And it's up to their businesses to negotiate together. And so Walgreens tends to be more, at least in my experience, more expensive. And really what GoodRx does is say, we're going to find the lowest price and we're going to show up and say, we'll give you a coupon to get us down to the lowest price across all the pharmacies in the city. That's all they're doing. And they claim to like help health benefits and all that. And they're just sort of full of it, because really what they're doing is they're just a coupon store. And I think it's a good thing, right? It is a good thing, especially when it's cheaper than with insurance. But they make money on each individual transaction, so they get a kickback, and then advertisements. So they advertise on their app, and that's how they make money. So, that answer your question? Okay. All right. So how do we actually do one of these things, and what are some of one of these economic evaluations, and what's the evidence that we actually need? Well, I'm going to talk just briefly about this, and then a little bit phase of development. I might skip some slides on cost effectiveness just because it just gets so like I'm teaching in pharmacy school, and that's not the audience. So I don't necessarily want to go down that road. But on the far left, this is where probably most of you live. This is not where I live. It's, can the drug be used safely? It's theoretical. Can it be used safely? Can it work? Can it be produced to high quality? Largely, we rely on randomized controlled trials, but for really rare conditions, one-arm studies are useful for regulatory agencies. Devices, if you're, say, a phase or a risk class 3 device, they may ask you to do a study, but maybe it's only one-armed, and there's some justification around why. But ultimately, you're trying to answer a theoretical question for the FDA or the EMA or whoever to approve. On the right-hand side, we're looking at, does the drug work and provide good value for money? It's a different question. It's more effectiveness-based rather than efficacy-based. And often we use the trial evidence, but we also use other sources. So it's at least in the model realm, this is what I do like all day, every day. I build these simulation models and try to estimate offsets in the system, quality of life for patients, are there extensions to survival? This is what I do on my day-to-day basis. And so it's a synthesis of evidence. It's just like using Cochrane evidence and really quantifying that, what I call chaos. Like, sure, it worked in the trial, but what if we combine everything else in our lives, which is totally chaotic? Is this still really going to work? And are we actually going to save money, or is it going to be increased money to the system? And our audience is public and private payers. We're not really interested in what the FDA thinks. The biggest example of this, the absolute biggest example, is Biogen's Alzheimer's drug, where the FDA approved it despite strong suggestions against, and we saw some folks that are very popular in the field jump off of that panel. And the FDA said, go ahead and approve it. And they charged $60,000 a year, and that's since been halved. But that's just the exact point of why the UK has a whole separate government body to deal with reimbursement. And the FDA just puts their hands up and says, we don't deal with anything about paying. We don't deal with anything with cost. And I mean, it's fine for them not to, but it's a total cop-out for the government to say something like that, in my opinion. Can you cover a bit about offsetting costs for, I'm going to get into that. So that's where we get into these forms of evaluations. There's a lot. I want to stress that cost effectiveness is not the same as cost benefit, and it's not the same as cost utility, and it's not the same as cost consequence. So cost consequences is very much like a consumer reports. Here's the efficacy of your drug. Here's the cost of your drug. Here's the mode of administration. Here's the cost offset, all disaggregated. So you can just see side by side. It leaves the decision maker with more of a difficult decision to make about whether this drug would be beneficial for their planned population. Cost effectiveness and cost utility are always used interchangeably. So that's a confusion from our field. But essentially what it means is there's a ratio of dollars that we're willing to pay, so incremental dollars between a new device or a new compound versus what's already on the market, or in some cases do nothing, which is a totally relevant comparison. divided by the, and I'll go over this again, divided by the change in effectiveness, which could be blood pressure, life years. We mostly live in quality adjusted life years land, which is very controversial in the US, but I can cover that if you really want to, but it gets me super fired up. So just fair warning. And then cost benefit is totally dollars. It's only money. So that means we have to translate how long you lived with drug A versus drug B, and we have to put a monetary amount to that. So think of cost effectiveness as already controversial. Cost benefit is even more controversial. And I've bolded cost effectiveness and return on investment because I'm actually going to give you the breakdown of how you do one of these on both of these cases. The other ones are, if you want more information, I'm happy to share. We just don't have the time to cover it. Budget impact is a payer, like how much more am I going to pay for premiums every month for my patients if I cover your device or your drug? And then return on investment is always like a hospital or provider perspective where, it's usually like a MBA in the hospital system that's trying to see if we're going to make money or mostly if we're not going to lose money by using a particular drug or device or any kind of intervention based on the investment costs and then the reimbursement that might be incurred. All right, so by life cycle, I know that this is drug specific, but I feel like this is the same with devices as well. It's just that it moves at a much faster pace because you're on engineering timeline, not drug development timeline. So the way I like to think about it is people start at phase 3 when they start talking about value, really even at the approval stage, small biotechs, and they usually come to us like, oh my gosh, we're being reviewed or we have to get this reimbursed. And I'm like, well, you can't go back into your phase 3 trial now. So that's why we actually really prefer to start in phase 1 and phase 2. And the reason for that is we can take your, what we call like a target product profile, if you ever had to develop one, which is just, here's the mechanism of action, here's the potential clinical signal that we would see. So let's use a simple example like HbA1c for diabetes. We think that our new device or drug can lower A1C for patients with persistently high HbA1c by 1% or 0.5%. And then you would ideally hire someone like me that can say, you can charge up to X dollars and get reimbursed easily if you meet this achievement. And we've done this on campus. We did this with the screening program called Autoimmunity Screening for Kids, where we actually published a paper that said we have to meet this benchmark for screening and education and awareness for this really to work and for national scaling of pre-symptomatic type 1 diabetes screening. So this is pretty common. Most companies are already doing this. Big pharma companies, they have this stuff. They have internal people, they hire consultants. They have a whole thing on this at phase 2. And I've done some of this work. Preference elicitation also happens. Like, what do your patients prefer? Because right here, you're dealing with preclinical and then safety. You're not talking about necessarily dosing yet or mode of administration, how the person's actually going to take the drug, the efficacy you haven't really established. You need to understand the dynamics of how you're delivering your system or your drug and really understand that part and how patients will, because remember, we talked about this, that's why I brought it up. Heterogeneity in patient preferences can influence drug usage big time. People totally downplay differences between mode of administration and just the way people live their lives can really impact how they take drugs, and especially for asymptomatic diseases. And then in the application, we're more in the sort of budget impact and payment scenarios. So again, this is where I live like phase 3 to kind of approval and then in the real world, how it's used. And I'll track these agreements over years. So we'll get into a contract and like with Medicaid, and we'll say, all right, we'll track this for the next 5 years and we'll have an assessment at the end of it. So that's often what we end up doing. Stephen asked, don't hospitals have a disincentive to go for a new cheaper therapy if the standard of care involves, of course, yeah, of course, Stephen. This is an issue, I think, that people also don't realize. What hospitals aren't payers. While they acquire drugs and they pay for drugs, there's no rebate system, there's no PBM involved. It's just them directly purchasing the drug. So this is why decision context and perspective matters. Whose bill is it? And they're just going to get, let's say they administer some drug in the hospital setting. They're not getting reimbursed for that. They're getting the DRG for that hospital stay, right? So they want to make sure that as you say, the standard of care, if it's cheaper, why would they purchase the more expensive drug? There's no reason why they would do that, right? Especially if it's administered as an acute sort of short-term hospital drug use. So, yep, that's absolutely right. So the nature of these assessments, I think, is much broader than, and often is much broader than your trials or your regulatory approval studies, whatever you want to call them. We want to talk about outcomes that people actually care about. If you come to me and you say, I can lower your LDL by X%. Well, I don't care. Am I going to live longer? Are you going to prevent me from having a heart attack? That's what I want to know as a just general person that has no experience in this, in health. That's what we want to know. That's why we use simulation models, because we can connect something like HbA1c to how long you're going to live in the future using 30, 40 years of longitudinal data on these patients. There's a lot of different effectiveness measures. Sometimes it's years of life gained. Sometimes it's incidence of a complication or symptom relief. I think it's really important that you think about, when you develop your drug, what's the clinical signal, but then how does that clinical signal translate? Is it more quality of life? Is it more survival? Is it something that, is a complication that doesn't really have a decrement to either one of these? That's the key, is thinking about how your product and how your clinical signal translates into something that people care about. People care about symptom relief. I care about living longer. I want to live really long. I mean, I want to live to a point, right? But, you want to live longer. You don't want to have CKD. You want to have lower symptoms. You don't want to be fatigued all the time. These things really matter. Quality adjusted life years are the reason why people have called me a death panelist, but it's actually not as bad as people say it is. It was originally put into the ACA. So if you've ever been on a PCORI study, you can't do anything cost effectiveness related. You can't do cost per quality. It's written in the legislation. So you can't fund any of those studies. And the argument has been, well, you're basically discriminating against disabled people or people in an age range that's higher than the average, like maybe over 50. And the reason is because the point of quality adjusted life years is really just to say we've combined quality and quantity of life into one metric that says over time, I'm not going to live at a 1 between 0, where 0 is death and 1 is perfect health. I'm not going to always live at 1. Maybe I'll break a leg, or maybe I'll get sick with COVID, or maybe I'll, just feel like crap for a few years. If you lose a loved one, you're not at a 1, that's for sure. I know that for a fact. So the idea is that we're just trying to compare incrementally. If you have this program, this intervention, can it improve both my quality and quantity of life? Sometimes it's more quantity, sometimes it's more quality. And it's good because we can compare across diseases. So we can't compare cost per LDL reduction with cost per reduction in incidence of CKD. It's just not really, it's not an apples to apples. So that's why the quality adjusted life year came about in sort of the 1970s. And there are some of the guys that invented it are still around, and I work with them. And essentially, whatever you hear about discrimination, it's not true. The person who wrote it turns out was on the board of a company, and I was doing an ISA report, and this person tried to get me fired. They were, at the time of writing this legislation, were totally bought out by one of the biggest companies in the country. And they put it in there because they didn't want negotiating power for a government entity to have on drugs. That's why they put it in. It has nothing to do with discrimination. Although it's not that the quality is perfect. I'm not saying it is. It's just they're not giving you the full story. This person's like on the news. They're really popular. I won't say their name, but it's really unfortunate. And this is the reason why I've gotten threats. Okay, so the ICER, I've kind of talked about this. It's the ratio or the difference in cost to the difference in effectiveness. And encompassed in this is the question that Melanie asked, where when we actually compare the costs between two interventions, we want to understand the non-intervention costs. So what if I had an offset from avoiding myocardial infarction or stroke or coronary revascularization? I want to understand that if I take this drug, how much of that cost offset is going to be on the medical benefit side versus the increase in the cost on the pharmacy benefit side. So it's this natural trade-off discussion, and that's weighed against the benefit that we gain from using the drug. So both of those are included in the system. And when you frame the question, we talked about this, you got to think about the population. Melanie brought up a good point that maybe we should target disease areas that don't have a lot of competitors. I think it's a really savvy idea. What are other comparators on the market? Is the viewpoint a hospital? To Stephen's point, maybe our system doesn't want to pay for that new drug because why would we? We're not going to get reimbursed. Maybe it's society, maybe it's just general healthcare insurance system. And then this is another point about outcomes. You might develop a drug and say, you might have a hard time arguing this to say it lowers this, but we won't actually see this happen until 15, 20 years in the future, right? So you might see this clinical signal and you're trying to tell people this is so important, we really need to talk about this, and they're not going to get it. You need to find a way to link it up with a long run perspective so that you capture all the effects. Think of like censoring in Kaplan-Meier plots, if you're familiar with that. We want to avoid the censorship problem. We want to go all the way until we can capture that outcome as long as possible, because that's really going to be, in the end, what's going to be the difference. I think we'll skip this for now. The point is most things live here. Most treatments are more effective and more costly. That's the world that we live in. But if you end up in some of these other quadrants, like the new treatment dominates, then you're in a really good spot and you'll be fine selling your drug. There's a few different steps, and there's kind of a, again, this is the part that I'm going to move through really quickly because I want to make sure we have time for discussion. But the perspective, I've already said this before, the perspective is so key. And the reason why it's so key is because why would a payer care about indirect productivity costs? This wouldn't be an employer plan like a Aetna or something. Why would they care if you missed time from work or if you didn't? They don't care. That's not adjusting in their budget. That's not going to take away from the money. It's hard to think about that. And I know people don't want to think about it, but it's true. Think of the budget. Who is reimbursing you? That's the perspective that you need to take. And those are the costs that you need to estimate. Always identify the alternatives. I think that that's one of the more important things. You might say this comparison doesn't really fit is the indication, but if there's even an inkling that it's actually true that a physician would use something off-label, you should include it in your cost effectiveness analysis. It's really important. The study design is kind of the best available evidence. That's a philosophical argument. We can get into that, but we usually rely on trials because they're mostly the best with treatment effects, I have to say, or they're the least biased, we'll say that. And then measuring costs, we do a lot of this work on campus. So we'll actually measure out and value how much time you're spending, like anything from just expanding a care model, how much more time are you spending with a patient? What are the different cost components of your device that you developed, all the way from the smallest parts and the labor to produce it, all the way up to like, every single thing that's included. And that could either be the proxy cost, which would be the price that you want to charge, or you can back into it and say, I want to be able to charge this, but we have to meet this kind of clinical benchmark. This is a framework that we've used in asthma, really where this hopefully, Melanie, will get closer to what you were talking about. We actually are asking about with cost offset. We include these 3 buckets of exacerbations for asthma. So some of these are, most asthma exacerbations just require an oral steroid burst. Patients feel like crap for about 2 weeks. They use short-acting SABA or something to just help them get through it. And then they're back on their kind of chronic medications. Sometimes they end up in the ER and sometimes they end up in the hospital. So the actual treatment effect from a drug is applied in the model so that the cost offsets show up from the new drug. So the arms are the same. We're saying this is for omalizumab or Xolair, if you're familiar with that drug. All we're saying is, let's assume the worlds are exactly the same. And the only difference is we have this relative risk reduction on exacerbations for omalizumab. And that will reduce patients moving to a hospitalization. It will reduce patients going to the ER, and it will reduce patients having to go get an oral steroid burst. So that improves their quality of life, and it shows up in cost offsets to the system. Now, with asthma biologics, they're so expensive, it doesn't even matter. They're just out of control, like 30 grand a year. They're not really worth it. And we just did a new report on that with ICER for a new drug that's not omalizumab. And how would we do that? How would we actually get there? Well, we're using unit costs. So this is kind of an outdated paper, but you see what we're actually costing out ER visits, hospitalizations. You have to remember these are averages. So they're really subject to outliers. Some of them, ER visit could be 15 grand. It could be $100 with a copay. It just depends on the contracts and what's set up. It's best that it's kind of an average cost. So as you can see, we're doing all these we're doing like the rate per person per year. And then we're actually including the exacerbation unit costs. And I think it's shown here. The relative risk is reduced, and then that flows into basically not having to pay as much for these unit costs for the treatments or for the management of those exacerbations. The next step, of course, would be report results, both disaggregated as well as differences. And then there's the dreaded cost per quality, and you can see that 300,000 in the US, there's been some recent work over and over again that has said we're at about 100,000 per quality adjusted life year. What does that mean? It means we're willing to pay 100,000 for one perfect year of life from an intervention. That's just in the health domain. That doesn't include societal effects like behavioral interventions or government policies that come in and say, we're going to improve the air quality and we're going to improve your neighborhood with more parks. That's totally separate. We're only in the health domain of are we willing to pay 100,000 per quality adjusted life year? I can tell you right now, for cancer, it's like 300 to 500,000 per quality. We're willing to pay a lot more. And that shows up in the market, especially for commercial insurers. We do a lot of sensitivity analyses. I talked a little bit about chaos. Really my job, most people spend, and a lot of economists spend their time trying to estimate the most precise treatment effect from a policy intervention. And really what I'm trying to do is say, I want to characterize the uncertainty around that treatment effect when so much else is going on. So what's the most likely scenario? What's the least likely scenario? And what's the least likely scenario on the worst end, I guess. I want to figure out how wide that confidence interval is, so to speak. And the wider it is, the harder it is to make a decision. The tighter it is, the easier it is to make a decision. In other words, in some cases, we know something is not cost effective with really good certainty. And we know in some cases that something is very cost effective with really good certainty. But a lot of the times we don't know if something is cost effective or not, because there's way too much uncertainty. Why am I telling you this? Because this method can actually be helpful in determining sample sizes for clinical trials. What are the endpoints that we need that we're still missing? How should we think about relative risk in this population? Should we do a subgroup analysis? So a lot of my work is actually using the model to say, you don't know enough about this. and you should go do another study in this area, either like a post-marketing observational study, maybe even prospective, if it's that big of an uncertainty. It's very important, and it's kind of how our field developed in this country. That's just kind of an option for sensitivity analyses to show you that it was kind of day-to-day symptoms that's the biggest driver in asthma. It's different in other disease areas. And then we use a lot of Monte Carlo simulations. I'm sure some of you have done that with PK/PD analyses, if you're familiar with that. And then, of course, limitations that we always cover. So I'll jump in. It looks like Stephen has a comment. But one point I've stressed over and over again, the economic evaluation method is influenced by the perspective of, I don't know why there's a question mark, of the person or entity paying for the intervention or service. True or false? Yes. There's still 4 people with us. Good. Nice. Good. Yes. And that the reason why I'm telling you this over and over again is because I hear this from clinical audiences all the time. Why isn't this being paid for? Why isn't this covered by insurance? It's because they don't care. It doesn't hit their budget. It has nothing to do with their wallet. Why would they care? It's a sad truth, but that's the case. Stephen says, from my perspective, developing cancer drugs overestimate the probability of significant extension of life. Insurance companies wind up paying up very expensive therapies that have. Yeah, it's true. Yeah, I can't argue with that. There's actually like a whole set of research called low value care that's been identified and that's still being used in hospitals every day. And it's like, why are we doing this? It's actually worse for the patient. It's more expensive for the system. And it's really hard, Stephen, I think, to change behavior when it's been established, especially if it's been recommended through guidelines. There is some research on like how much a black box warning will impact prescribing. And I know some of our colleagues at the School of Pharmacy have done that. But you're absolutely right. I mean, we're just covering therapies that we're making promises to patients that we just can't keep. And I'm tired of seeing the Kaplan-Meier plot have the difference of my fingernail as between the control and the treatment group. It's embarrassing that this is even getting published and getting covered. You know, it's just, anyways, I'll get all upset about it, so I should move on. So ROI is the other one that you might run into, and it's not like you have to be in a hospital to do a return on investment calculation, but really the point of it is the hospital's bills are such a function of reimbursement at the sort of grouped level. So like DRGs, or, you know, maybe even though it's generally fee for service based, there's bundled payment options, of course, but they're trying to improve and reduce, you know, really maximize the revenue that they're getting from that reimbursement. And so any addition in cost is such a big, you know, add, and they're just really, really concerned that they're not going to gain, you know, enough money to to stay in business. It's embarrassing to even say that, but nonprofits are like UC Health are making plenty of money. I have no problem with it. It's just ROI isn't really that big of a deal for big systems like that. And ROI is another ratio. It's net returns from improvement divided by investment in improvement actions. So same kind of thing. We want to scope the services, the timeline for implementation. What is sort of the comparison group? What would happen without? And then the financial contributors back to like, are there cost offsets? If we avoided, you know, if we gave someone this drug in this setting and we could avoid them coming back as a, you know, because there's some government policies that essentially are saying, if you come back and that same patient shows up, that's on you, and we're not going to reimburse you for that. That's a big deal, and we want to make sure that we avoid that. And that goes into the calculation, the cost offset potential. This is available on AHRQ's website, by the way. And really, ROI is gets all the way down to the personnel, supplies, training, what's the IT systems. And, I express this a lot to our school that if you're going to buy equipment, and you really should be looking at the accounting over time, the depreciation, you should maximize the use of that equipment. I mean, you should be out there selling the use of that equipment every single day, so that not only are you covering your costs, you're getting a return on that. If we're spending $1 million on this new equipment, make money off of it. The net returns is usually kind of these net changes between revenues and costs. And this is the part that's hard, I think, for a lot of people, because you probably have run into this case, maybe some of you have. There's no way to reimburse it. There's no code for it. You don't know if it would be reimbursed under durable medical or under the pharmacy benefit. There's no code, period. So you may actually have to lobby to get a addition to reimbursement, and that can be really challenging, and it's almost out of your hands. It's kind of hard to do, but you have to make the case either through cost effectiveness or budget impact or return on investment, that you have to just shout it to people's faces that, look, if you don't use this, or if you do use this, you're actually going to save money, even if you have to add a reimbursement code. You might run into that situation. And then ROI is a little bit different than cost effectiveness. It's really bounded between 1 and it should be -1 and -1. But if it's greater than 1, meaning that it's not a great return. If it's greater than 1, it's positive, you're making money. An ROI of 1.8 says every dollar you invest, you're getting $1.80 back. If it's less than 0, then you're losing money, like a -1.5. And in between 0 and 1 is this sort of toss up. You're not actually recouping all of your costs, but I've seen hospitals cover it because it's so good for patients. The benefit is so high. And maybe this happens a lot. Maybe they don't have the evidence on cost offsets yet, and they need to generate that. They may cover it for now and say, we'll pay for it, but then we got to reevaluate the ROI in a year or 2 years, 3 years, to see if maybe we might be greater than 1. The reality is it's all over the place. For new visits, for patients, you might be greater than 1. For established visits, it might be less than 0. You want to try to find an average and really get refined estimates, but present it in a way that people can consume it easily. So that's the other kind of calculation. If you're interested, I can always share with you about budget impact calculations. Very similar. There are a lot of cost offsets, and the perspective is different. Cost benefit is something that I do mainly as a consultant for companies like litigation. I'll do some CBA stuff. It's not common in health. I wouldn't even bother going down that road. And if you're going to do a cost consequence, you may as well just do cost effectiveness, because you're getting every single step but the ratio to get there. So you can email me that if you have any questions. So just quick summary, and then we'll open it up for discussion. Just to reiterate, economic evaluation is informing indirect price negotiations. Your value portfolio is really often required, especially at the commercial level. They're going to ask you to put some form of a dossier together, either that's AMCP dossier or something that says, this is my justification for you covering this drug. And get used to synthesis of evidence. It's going to happen. You cannot answer every question with your clinical trial or your approval study. You got to go out and find other sources of evidence. It's necessary. I've said this over and over again: values, context, and perspectives specific. Melanie and I have had this discussion. Who's paying for it? Decide who's paying, and then figure out what you need to show to be able to get that covered and reimbursed. Payers like public and private, they consider value, but not very explicitly. In fact, most of their decisions aren't explicit, but they do consider value. So you should consider kind of budget impact as well as cost effectiveness. We usually do both at the same time. And then finally, please start your value portfolio early. Think about it. At least talk to someone like me about it early, and just understand that Just because you get it approved doesn't mean you're going to be able to sell it. So I have this, or we can just open it up to discussion with a small group. Let me just exit out of this.
Well, I'll start by asking a question.
Yeah.
My question is related to the area that I work in. And so if you're looking at an area like end-stage renal disease that has, specific constraints around cost per treatment, and you're trying to offset something with something else because you can't keep adding, because then you're over the threshold for what you're allowed to charge for a treatment, for example. And so I think, that's it's an interesting question, but in terms of analysis or things to look at, you're really looking at cost offsetting, because you're switching out something for something else, or potentially reducing something to add something else so that the math works. And so you and I have had kind of some of these discussions before, but I'm also thinking that, in terms of, I'll say it, quality of life years. And does that directly come into that, into those equations, do you think, if you're doing like a direct cost effectiveness analysis, like in that kind of a setting?
Probably not. Probably less so in that setting. Although, because I think really our conversations have been on your product, it is much more of a replacement of an existing, and it's a lower cost replacement. I don't really think you need to go there, to say that, although I think you do have the option, and it does have the option to improve quality of life. And I'm not totally sure you even need to go there, if that makes sense. So.
Okay, but that seems like that would be an additional selling point, is if you could show something related to that, in addition to, a cost offset, because then, if you're dealing with, kind of that, not severity of illness, but in terms of, the quality, of the illness or the lack thereof, if you're able to pull in some additional pieces to those kind of analysis, it seems like that potentially could be a bigger seller.
Of course, you always want to build, I think, a broader story. I've been in the room on some like advisory boards with payers, and there was one that was really sticks out to me. And this big insurance company, huge, he said, we don't even, include quality adjusted life years. We don't really care about quality of life. I was like, okay, well, fair enough. And then day 2 comes around, and the same guy said, well, that has a really negative impact on someone's quality of life. We wouldn't cover that drug because of that. Everyone was like, whoa. And then we totally caught him in his tracks. And he was like, yeah, you're right. So you're never going to get them to admit that whatever evidence you present, they're going to explicitly make their decision based on that, right? So it's all poker face stuff, and it's one of those where I agree with you. I think you should build out a bigger story, but it's also difficult to know what the points they're going to make the decision based on. So you can go in and say, here's everything. And if they say, yep, great, we'll cover it, you're never going to find out what information that they actually use to make that decision. So that is why I think it is important to present, here's the positive. And you may as well be somewhat transparent that it's not perfect in this area. Maybe we have some room for improvement, and just admit it. It's just hard to figure out payer decision making. It just is. And we actually are studying that, and it's just all over the board, which is actually not a great result for the American public, I have to say. It's actually the worst result you could get. So looks like Floyd is asking, is there data or theory about profitability of drugs that have compound patent protection versus use patent versus orphan protection. Yeah, I think I know what you're asking. Just in general, and I think what you're asking is there a, first of all, the size of the population matters because you get expedited regulatory approval decisions. And then often you're the first in class. So you can just charge whatever you want and a payer is not going to reject it. Then you might be in another bucket, which is, I would say like novel biologics, where maybe there's one or two other competitors. We call that a duopoly. Hep C is one of the bigger ones where there was one, like the first to market made a lot of money. And then there were like 6 drugs after that came through. And that's an area where there's a lot of competition and prices really came down. My point is you need a lot of competition to bring prices down. And you really need a generic in there or a biosimilar to bring the price down. If you get orphan status or you get your patent extended or you have more indications, I would say you're in a good spot. So there's plenty of data on that.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to your comment about diagnostics. You had mentioned that, about the payers. And so like for people that maybe are developing diagnostics, what would be some things that they need to think about in terms of positioning themselves in a good way to, have a better chance at fighting that battle?
Yeah, I think if you develop a diagnostic and there's a clear path for treatment, you're in a better position than developing a diagnostic where there's not a clear path for treatment. And the reason why is because you're putting the payer in a position where they really have nothing that they can do without a treatment option. And they'll just say, well, why am I even doing this? Then they'll come up with an excuse that says, yeah, if I do a diagnostic and there's no treatment option, I'm just scaring the patients. And now they have nothing to do with this information. So I would say, I would, if I was in diagnostics, I would figure out the lab problem, number one. How do you make this so cheap because this is the thing that bothers me the most is labs will charge, they just will charge whatever. I don't even understand how they come up with this. And I've talked to people about it that develop assays and there's no clear answer because they're all like, no offense, they're all like scientists. They don't think about this stuff. They're just charging whatever their finance person is telling them to charge. There's no justification. You got to lower that cost as much as you possibly can and go for volume rather than go for a high price diagnostic that's only going to be covered by a few people. There's a total trade-off between volume and price that you really gotta think about, in my opinion. The other thing you can do is go in and offer risk sharing agreements, like I was talking about earlier, to say, we get that this is a new diagnostic and it's a little bit more expensive than what you were paying before. What if we came up with this deal where we would cover the first year and we could track the outcomes and see that patients are doing better with this diagnostic? So there's a few, and they're much more reasonable with those discussions rather than on pharmaceuticals, because manufacturers don't want to negotiate, period. I think there's a lot more wiggle room in the diagnostic market between payers and in the lab folks that produce those. So
how do the payers look at combination treatments where, for a particular disease indication, it was discovered that putting 2 drugs together is a lot better than one on its own? I'm looking at a project now where potentially a 3rd drug may add to this cocktail would be a lot better, but only for a subset of the population where we potentially curative for that larger group. Do you all go back in and renegotiate a price? Do you just slap on the price of that new drug to the
cocktail? I'll direct you towards the multiple myeloma market, which is just a collection of, I'm going to just throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks. And I say that because I actually did the CAR-T multiple myeloma report for ICER. In there, the NCCN, just look at the NCCN guidelines. If you can make sense of that, you should win. You should get a PhD for just making sense of the NCCN guidelines around multiple myeloma. It's just combining 2, 3, in some cases 4 drugs together and getting better efficacy, but the patient is way worse. But yes, payers are just essentially additive of the cost of those combination treatments. Depends on what you mean. Like if you're developing a combination therapy itself versus just adding 1, 2, 3 drugs, the combination therapy probably won't be an addition. Like it won't be this drug plus this drug. It'll be some multiplier that is in the middle that ends up, you price it at a premium, but you're not going to charge as much as you would adding those 2 together. So it just kind of depends on how it's developed, and of course the health benefits and the disease area. But multiple myeloma is probably the example that I'd say it's gotten so out of control. You're talking an average course in a disease area in which the average survival is somewhere around like 5 years. You're spending around $700,000 on that patient. So very, very, so much uncertainty around that.
So what about companion diagnostics? Let me go back to my
Melanie,
diagnostic.
I'm just not answering your question, am I?
So what if you take a companion diagnostic and then, I mean, do you have much experience with that? And I mean, is there a better chance or a likelihood
Define that
making
for me.
story? Well, like something that would, be like a genetic test or a biomarker that would help you select drug therapies better and or monitoring some aspect of a drug therapy.
Yeah, there's a whole argument. Whole genome sequencing is one of those arguments right now. Like if we're going to do it, let's just do whole genome sequencing, either at newborn stage or whatever, right? Instead of waiting for symptoms to happen and then doing individual diagnostic tests. That's like one example. I think that might be what you're talking about, where we just combine a bunch of different tests into one and we screen for a bunch of different rare diseases instead of waiting for something to happen and then screening for each one of those individually. It's actually cheaper to do whole genome sequencing than to do that individual course over time. That's just one example. I don't totally think that's what you're talking about. But
yeah. So like, for example, like gene changes in a patient's tumor that would make them susceptible to, drug X, Y, and Z and not to A, B, and C. Or, in my space, looking at, maybe biomarkers for toxicities to a drug where we have like pretty high risk of toxicities. And then you're able to kind of assess for risk factors for the toxicity or the development of the toxicity during the treatment.
It's a good question. I don't have a ton of experience in that area, but I would probably say if it's going to help patients get on a better treatment, that's kind of an area where payers are a little bit more lenient on what they would cover versus what they would not. Because in the end, the last thing that a payer would want to do is pay for a script or pay for an outpatient drug or a physician administered drug and then find out that they have to switch and pay for a different one because the previous one didn't work. The payers hate that. That's like the number one thing they're trying to avoid. So it depends on how much the test costs, but somebody's doing the calculation at the payer level where they'll say if this particular disease costs this much, and we add this diagnostic test, what's the offset? And that's a pretty straightforward calculation, but my guess is they would be probably more open to that because there's nothing they hate more than, oh great, I just paid for this, and now all of a sudden I have to switch and pay for a different drug. It's just, and I have to pay for the side effects that happened for that patient because they showed up in the hospital. They don't want to do that. The only area where I would say that that's not the case is if they have a very strict formulary and they make you fail something to go through a different channel on a different drug. I don't know what they do about that when it's combined with diagnostics. I have no idea, but I'm sure it's talked about. So. So is everyone else probably asleep, not on their computers, or not on their
Just have
videos?
one
What
last
about some of the teams out there? If you have a device or a drug or a diagnostic, do you have questions for Brett while he's on here? Have you
I
thought
told you
about?
I could make everyone fall asleep.
It's one
question.
for a free consultation.
Yeah,
To the
well,
team.
we have Brett right here in front of us.
You had mentioned that having a TPP profile helps you craft some of these kinds of analyses. At what stage of development do you have to have that fully fleshed out before you start dabbling in some kind of this analysis? Or would you create sort of a model and then adjust one of those parameters as your TPP?
Yeah, usually the TPP comes to us before we've developed the model. And it's usually phase 2, A or B, either one. But I think it's iterative over time, right? So I've seen one drug that the TPP totally changed over time, and it was like it wasn't the same TPP when we started. So that happens, and I think it has to be a changing document. But ideally, that would come to us so that we could build a model based on historical evidence. So, for example, I want to know what's the clinical signal, and then is there a link between that clinical signal and long-run survival? So, like, is there actually a way that I can connect the dots and say, if you have a really high lab value in this area versus a really low lab value, is there even a just weak association between that? So I can just make some general assumptions about the trajectory of a person with and without the drug. But then at the same time, I also can use that information to say, well, if you don't make this threshold that you're proposing in your trial, then you're not going to be cost effective. So it's kind of both ways. The direction is often both ways. It's not just they give us something, we produce something back, and there's a dialogue there. But in the US, it's most of what I get paid to do in the consulting realm is, all right, come up with this answer, and then they say, well, you're full of it. Why isn't this cost effective? And I said, well, how'd you come up with the price? And they said, I'm not even kidding you. I literally heard this. It was a nice even number. And the nice even number was multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars. And my response back was, I used all the evidence and I put all this stuff together and I quantified with a lot of uncertainty that's acknowledged and limitations that are acknowledged. And I'm the one who's full of it. And it got pretty quiet after that. So, they just make prices here. That's what it is. And I would do the same if I was in that, if I did that job, but I just don't, that's not something I'm really interested in doing. So.
Do you have any experience with radiation reimbursement, radiation therapy?
No, I don't, but I've dealt with so many different areas. Nothing surprises me. If you want to have a chat, we can talk about it offline if you want to.
Okay, yeah, that would be great. It's a strange world, and there's a very broad, specifically, I guess, and maybe as a general question for here, that there's a fairly broad array of different treatment options that providers can choose from, and the reimbursement rates also vary widely by like a factor of 20. And so, so if you're introducing a new device into that realm, I mean, do you just kind of shoot somewhere in the middle? It might be difficult to be at the very bottom, but certainly it's possible to fall within the range. And is that generally, should that be my target, I guess, just broadly speaking?
Yeah, I'd actually just like to know a little bit more before I answer your question. So you should just email me, because I'm not familiar, but I really like learning about this stuff, because you might say that it's really odd, but I can tell you there's way crazier things going on.
Okay.
than what you're explaining. But if you just shoot me does everyone here, I can put it in the chat if you don't have my email.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
It's confusing because it's not Brett.
I know it's Robert and it's like my first name, and I know it's very confusing, but yeah. Was this helpful?
Yeah, I think this was great, Brett. And, you know, people will probably be reaching out, and certainly anybody on the Zoom here that is in the new cohort, you know, to start kind of thinking about those. And we talked about the TPP a little bit. We introduced that in the kickoff meeting about a month ago. So, you know, it might be good to kind of think through some of those, and you know, the TPP profile, and I guess I'm saying P profile twice, but the TPP, and then, you know, maybe have a conversation with Brett and, you know, kind of see where you would, you know, position, or at least start thinking about positioning things within the reimbursement scheme and the value proposition.
Yeah. Yeah. Which again are two sort of different things, you know, I mean, you first have to figure out who's going to pay for it, right? And then after that, you kind of have to figure out how am I going to convince them to pay for it. And you know, I think you're gonna encounter a less scientific process than what you've gone through to get your drug or your device or whatever it is that you've developed. Payer decision making is not based on science. It's very loosely based on evidence on purpose. So just like, have any of you seen The Big Short?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's a line in there that basically says, we've created all these acronyms and we've, you know, developed all of these terms, and it's just to confuse you. And it's just to make you confused and not understand that what we're doing is, you know, borderline illegal. And in that case, it was illegal in that movie. The same thing's going on in the payer world, and in my opinion, the manufacturer world, where things on the face value seem like, oh, that seems relatively logical. And then you start digging, or maybe it doesn't. And then you start digging, and there's just a lot there that's sad and disturbing. But I think the important thing is we have to keep developing new medicines and new technologies. It's the only thing you can do. And all of that is out of your control. The point is to walk into it and say, I know that this is going on. Don't be surprised when you see it, and don't react to it. Just be persistent about your product and your development of your product, and, you know, understand all the politics going on, because they're very deep, and the government is not here to help you. So everyone's really getting the real, it's like 5:40 and you've got the real Brett now. And am I turning into Robert or am I Brett? I don't know.
Very, very uplifting. Thanks, Brett.
Yeah, I know. I have to say, I wish I wasn't as cynical as I am, but I just, you know, it just got bad after a few years of being really involved in this market. And I didn't think it would get so political so quickly, and it really did. And Melanie, you know, kind of some of the groups that I work with, and I'm at the kind of intersection of everyone. And that's why I've become more cynical, because, you know, but I think what you guys are doing is great. That's my point. And keep developing. You are not the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Keep doing your thing, and I'm happy to help where I can.
Yeah, and somebody might even find that anti-cynical drug.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's not like we make only bad drugs. We make really good drugs.
Oh, wait, somebody has their hand up here.
Yeah, there we go.
What happened?
Oh, you're on mute.
A quick question on the European market versus the US market. Now, the same drugs that are even produced by American USA in the European markets are like 10 times cheaper minimum.
Yeah.
So can you explain how come the same drug made by the same company can be a $10 in France, for example, versus 120 in the US.
Yeah. Yeah, I kind of alluded to some of that earlier, but essentially they have direct negotiating power. That's one of the key pieces. So they have like an FDA for paying for drugs.
But it's still not, doesn't like, I understand you can negotiate, but that's a quite hard to explain 10 times difference, correct? Like,
yeah, it's not everything. The other piece that they have is they can trade drugs across borders where we cannot. So we can't actually import drugs from Canada legally, although there's kind of been some changes around that. That's not going to solve our problem, by the way, though. And then they also have a less generous patent system. So they don't, that biosimilar use is way much higher in Europe than it is in the US, because they won't let you do a Humira situation where you're paying that much. And Humira is one of the biggest expenses for every payer in the country. I know it because I know the data and I've seen it. So that's the kind of stuff where Europe's already moved on to a biosimilar, and then, you know, the negotiation actually explains a lot, and here's why. Because there are drugs like the cystic fibrosis drugs or the SMA drugs, they just don't cover it, and the company says, well, we just won't sell it in your country. That when you're talking about $1 million for one infusion, it does actually hit the budget quite a bit. And remember, they actually consider the trade-offs, so that if you take away that $1 million from somewhere else to help that one child, these are the health benefits that you're losing in the rest of your population. They're just explicit when they talk about it. And here it's so controversial to say something like that that's where I lose people, and most people just say, what is this guy talking about? But really what I'm telling you is that's the reality. That's what's happening, whether we want to admit it or not. So.
great, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, last call for questions for Brett. Well,
And on a positive note, maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah. I have 2 puppies and a baby, and they're really cute. So.
All
and
right.
I like them a lot. So, you know, I'm not all negative in my real life. So.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Brett. And this was really
thanks for having me.
I'm sure people will be reaching out to you, and hope everybody has a great night. It looks like the sun's out and we're supposed to get some really nice weather. So.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.